Hello ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this pre-recorded version of the Unit 9 seminar. Tonight we're going to be talking about monopolies, but before we do, let's go ahead and review what we covered last week in Unit 8. You might recall that last week, again, we went over the various costs and how they are computed, looking at variable and average total and average fixed and marginal costs. Okay? We spent some time discovering the what we call our break-even price. And remember, all the price is we compute a cost, and we're considering that these are perfectly competitive market businesses. So it's many small businesses. So they're stuck with the price they're given. They don't have a choice in their price. And so once they know what their cost is, their lowest average total cost, or their minimum cost output price, or output level, then that amount of money becomes their break-even price. At that price, if they get that price, they're covering all of their costs. And remember, when we talk in economic terms, we're referring to a fair return to capital is included in there, but no excess profits, no economic profits, if you will, but a fair return to capital, which is an accounting profit. So we figured out how to find that number, that price, whatever it is, and that would be the lowest average total cost. Whatever price equals that cost, that would be our break-even price. Anything below that, now in the terms of the any price above that would return an economic profit. I think your assignment just calls it a profit, but that's sufficient as long as we understand we're talking economic profit. And a price below that point may not cover all of the cost of operation, but they should be making some contribution to the fixed costs. So to figure out what that next price level is, there is a price level below which we don't want to produce anymore because we're not even covering our variable cost. If you think of our pie example, we're really referring to not covering the cost of our ingredients or the labor that makes it. Okay? So we find that value by looking at the lowest average variable cost, and cancel that out. So we go to our lowest average variable cost, and a price below that point, equal to or below that point, no longer returns us enough money to pay for our variable cost or our ingredients and labor. Okay, and so beyond that point, we sure don't want to be producing. It would be like, if you remember our pie example, and we said that we had $4 worth of variable cost and $1 worth of fixed costs for our pie. Beyond that, if the price drops below $4, we don't want to produce the pie anymore because it would cost us more in ingredients than we could get for it. So that's what our shutdown price is all about. And your assignment this past week had you computing the break-even price and the shutdown price for a dairy operation, and then looked at different prices that dairy operator could get for their milk and compared that with their break-even price and with their shutdown price to see if A, they were determining or making an economic profit, or B, should they continue in business. Now in that middle ground between the shutdown price and the break-even price, as I said a minute ago, basically any price in that middle area is covering all of the variable cost, and anything above that variable cost is a contribution to the fixed costs. So at least it's contributing something. So in the short run, it would be okay to produce there, but only in the short run. In the longer time frame, you wouldn't have enough money coming in, enough revenue coming in to cover your fixed costs. So then you would need to go, stop that operation also. Okay, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. Tonight we want to change our thinking. Remember, up to this point, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about monopolies. And before we do that, let's remember that so far we've been talking about what's called a perfectly competitive industry. That means there are many, many, many small suppliers. No one supplier is supplying so much that they can control the price. And there are many, many, many small buyers. No buyer buying so much that they can control the price. Okay? In that case, a supplier in this business does not see the entire demand curve for the industry. They only see the equilibrium price as a flat demand curve. In other words, that is their only price option. Okay? That is different for another, and you might also remember that when we were talking about this, that in a perfectly competitive industry, the business, the single business, is a price taker. They are stuck with that price that's given by the equilibrium point in the supply and demand analysis. And again, when we made this computation, we said that marginal revenue is equal to the price, and we went through a lengthy definition of what marginal revenue was, because so far you had computed marginal costs. So here we threw a new term at you last week. It was called marginal revenue. And one of the reasons that we spent so much time discussing it last week was it will play a much more important role in tonight's discussion. So basically, in a perfectly competitive market like we were looking at previously, the price is the marginal revenue. That will be different tonight. Okay, so what is this thing called a monopoly? Well, here we see a demand curve, okay? But what is different in a monopoly industry is there is only one supplier. And you either pay their price or you don't get it. It's as simple as that. They have the ability to set the price. Okay? So, what would it look like? Well, we would have a supply curve, but in this case, the monopoly company sees that entire demand curve. They don't just see the equilibrium point, they see the entire demand curve. And what they want to do is produce where their marginal revenue equals marginal cost, just like our perfectly competitive business does, because that's going to be the least costly place to produce at. Well, how does that work? Okay. Well, let's assume for a minute that the marginal revenue point is this yellow point right here. Okay. And it's below the equilibrium point, but it's on the supply curve. It's the point where marginal revenue is going to equal marginal cost. But what the monopolist wants to do, they want to produce at that level, but they want to charge a price that is the most that customers will pay for that quantity of product. Okay. So a much higher price, if you will, than what they would get in a perfectly competitive market. But there are no competitors, so they are the only supplier. And I'm sure you can think of many industries where that's true for. Think of your electricity. Where does the electricity come from? Is there a competitor? You could go to somebody else and say, I want to buy electricity from you. Well, it's the same power line coming in. It's only the power company who can sell you electricity. Same thing true for water. If you're going to have water lines coming into your house and sewage lines going out, you don't have a choice in who you get your water from. Unless you're buying bottled water or having water trucked in, you don't have a choice. Okay, so there is only a single supplier in those cases. So, how do they price their services, especially if there were no government intervention? And we'll talk about that in just a moment too. So, why is this marginal revenue different for a monopoly than it is for a perfectly competitive market. Well, what we're going to find out is in all cases when there's a monopoly, the marginal revenue will always be less than the price. And there's a couple reasons for that. Okay? So, what is marginal revenue again? It's going to be the change in total revenue caused by the last sale. Okay? Just like our marginal cost was the change in total cost caused by the last production, the last item you produced. Okay, so we know what a definition of marginal revenue is. Okay? Basically, what does a monopolist do if they want to increase sales? For some reason, they want to increase the number of sales. Okay, so that they can get closer to their ideal point. Well, the only way the monopolist can increase sales is to reduce prices. Okay, because we know if the lower the price, the more customers will come. So he's going to have to reduce prices. So the question becomes, what happens then? Well, we actually have two effects. The first effect is called the price effect. We had a little bit of a hint of that earlier in one of the units. Okay, but basically the price effect is going to be the change in total revenue caused by all the existing customers who were paying the higher price now paying the new lower price if we've lowered our prices. So let's see an example of that. Okay, so we have the definition. I'll leave the definition there for you. And what we're going to do is use an example here where in the beginning we have a price of $10 and we have 50 sales. Okay, so if we lower our price to $8, we get more sales. So in this case, our example is going to say that we had 70 sales once we lowered our price to $8. Now the question becomes, we see what the total revenue is. When our price was at $10, we were making a total revenue of $500. Okay? When our price went to $8, we have more revenue coming in. We have $560 now, so we gained $60. So let's see what actually happens. Okay? Well, remember, we had how many old sales? We had 50 old sales. Okay, so that's still buying now, but they're buying now at the new price. So we have 50 who are now buying at $8 rather than 10. Okay? And so that gives us $400. But what were they bringing us in at the old price? Well, at the old price, they were bringing in $500. So we had 50 of them at $10. That gave us $500. So if we subtract the old price from the new price, we find out that in effect, the price effect of this change in price lost us $100 on those 50 customers. So that is the price effect. The price effect is how much those existing customers that are now paying the lower price, how much revenue have we lost from them? That is the price effect in a case of lowering the price. Okay. There's also a second effect, and that is the quantity effect, which is what lets us get this marginal revenue, which is always lower than the price. Okay. And so what is this quantity effect? Well, let's go take a look at that. Remember, the quantity effect is the change in total revenue caused by the change in the number of customers. Well, here we lowered the price, so we have some new customers. The quantity effect is how much revenue do those new customers give us? Well, here's an example. We go back to the same example we had earlier. Originally, we had 50 customers. Now, our new sales are 70 customers. So if we subtract the 50 we had originally, that means we now have a new 20 customers. and these new 20 customers are each paying $8. So we have a quantity effect of $160. But our total revenue did not change by $160. It only changed by 60. See, up here we look at the total revenue going from 500 down to 560, okay, or up to 560. So we gained $60 by this price change, but our quantity effect was a plus 160. But remember, we had a price effect of a negative 100. So what ends up happening is we lower the price, we have more customers multiplied by that new higher price. If we were to raise our price, what would have happened? Well, if we had raised our price, we would have lost customers. Okay? So then our quantity effect would have been how many customers did we lose when we raised our prices, and how much revenue did they take away? Okay, because they were no longer buying from us because we raised our price. Okay, and we would also have a price effect if we'd raised our price, which says, in effect, of the old existing customers that were paying the lower price, how much new revenue are they bringing in when we raised the price? And the ones that stayed with us were now paying the higher price. Okay? So the exact opposite of what we saw a minute ago. So we can go in either direction. It depends on what we do with our price. But if you focus on what happens when you lower the price, then it should be very clear what happens with the price effect and what happens with the quantity effect. Okay? So remember, price effect is a change in total revenue caused by all the customers, the existing customers, now paying the newer price. And the quantity effect is the change in total revenue caused by the new number of customers, okay, purchasing at this new price. And so therefore, with these two effects playing off each other, and one goes in one direction, the other goes in the other direction, that causes us to always have a situation when there's a monopoly where the marginal revenue is no longer, it'll be less than the price. Okay. So we can look at some cost curves, and here we have marginal cost, and we have our average total cost at the low point. Okay, so what we want to do, we know that our marginal revenue is lower than our demand curve, or lower than the price. Okay, so if we insert our marginal revenue curve in this particular situation, and just coincidentally it crosses the marginal cost curve right at the point where the average total costs are the lowest. So right here at our starting point. Okay, now we see that we have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Okay, but what the company or the monopoly wants to do is they want to charge the highest price that the demand will pay, that consumers will pay for that quantity of output. So that said, this extra area above the lowest average total cost, or where the total cost is when marginal cost equals marginal revenue, is what we now call monopoly profits. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, we would have called that economic profits, but here it is no longer a perfectly competitive market. There is only one producer, and they set the price. So it's not set by market forces, it is set by the monopoly. So those profits are what we call monopoly profits. Is that good or bad? Well, it depends. If we go back in time to the late 1800s, 1873, give or take a little, there was a major recession, okay? A panic, they called it. We would call it today a recession. And basically, it hurt farmers because what happened was, remember, at that time, virtually all agriculture was by extremely small farms. Okay? So a farmer and their family would farm their land. Okay? But where are they? And they're out in the Midwest. Where is the food needed? Well, the food's needed in the big cities, back in Chicago and St. Louis and in the big cities where all the people are. Okay? So the idea was the railroads came through and the farmer could grow food and then put it on a railroad and ship it to the the centers of civilization, if you will, or the centers of population, so that they could sell their product. Well, because there was a recession, the price that they could get for their food was very low. Okay? But the price that they were going to have to pay to transport it by railroad was set by the monopoly railroad. What do we mean by a railroad being a monopoly? Well, if you build a railroad into a particular area, let's say you're going to start a railroad, you're going to build a railroad in, and forget about all the roads and the interstate highway system, because in the 1870s that didn't exist. Okay? And there were a few dirt paths, but that was it. And if you needed to ship something from, let's say, somewhere out in Iowa back to St. Louis or to Chicago, your choice was put it on a horse and buggy wagon and go very slowly, as fast as that horse would take you, the hundreds of miles it would take to get to a big city. Okay? So it was very ineffective, right? But once the railroads came, now you could load that same produce onto the railroad and ship it to the big city, and it would be there within a day. Okay? So this was a very effective way of, changing transportation. But what happens is it's very expensive to build a railroad. And so if an entrepreneur builds a railroad into a particular community, nobody else is going to go and build another railroad into that community, because they have to get the land and they have to lay the tracks and they have to get the railroad equipment and all the rest of it to be able to serve that community. And there's already a railroad there. So instead they're going to go somewhere else and start their railroad. Okay? So we end up with only a single railroad providing service in that particular area. Therefore, it is a monopoly. Well, the monopolist, we saw, is going to charge the highest price they can. Well, the farmers joined together in what was called the Grange movement. Okay? And this was if you will, an organization, ultimately a lobbyist organization, started by a group of farmers. And remember, these are all small farms. And their objective was to go to the federal government and say, you've got to make some changes in the law. You've got to regulate these railroads. Okay? Well, it took the government a while to do this, because remember, the railroads were the rich people that had all the money that were buying the politicians. But when all these farmers came in and said, if you don't regulate these railroads, we're not going to vote for you, and you're not going to be in office. And guess what? No matter how much money the railroads pay you, if you don't get votes, you don't stay in office. So the politicians said, well, Mr. Railroad owner, Mr. Vanderbilt, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to pass this law. So finally in 1880, I think it was 1880, the government did pass a law called the Interstate Commerce Act. And what it did is it set up a government organization called the Interstate Commerce Commission. And its mission was to regulate the railroads, to make sure the railroads did not get excess profits, that they were not discriminating in the treatment of their customers by charging exorbitantly high rates. Okay? So here was a case where the countervailing power of the government was used to as leverage, if you will, to control the railroads. Okay? Now, as an aside, I'll just throw you a little additional information that you may or may not want to know. This went fine until about the 1930s. In the 1930s, the railroads said, wait a minute, we got all these people with trucks. And they And there's roads built now. Not great roads, but roads. Okay? And so these trucks were coming in and taking some of the business of the railroads. And the railroad said, wait a minute, Mr. Regulator, you got to regulate the trucks too. And sure enough, the government said, well, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We'll regulate the trucks too. Starting in about 1931, 32, I forget the exact year, interstate trucking came under the regulation of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And that existed from 1930 to about 1990, 1985, 1990. One of the reasons why I'm very aware of this is I did my master's thesis on why trucking should not be regulated. Okay? And then I ended up collecting much of my data from the Interstate Commerce Commission. And after I completed my master's degree, they hired me. And I went to work at the Interstate Commerce Commission for 3 years. And I left just prior to deregulation. I left in 1979, and I want to say the Motor Carrier Act of 1982 deregulated trucking industry. So anyhow, bottom line is that this was an example of the government stepping in to regulate the monopolies. Now, when we talk about water, most times the local water authority, if you will, is controlled by your local government, by either the county or the state government or sometimes the city government. Likewise, the electricity. Electricity will be at least regulated by the State Utilities Commission, Public Utilities Commission, so that in effect, the government is looking over their shoulder, making sure they're not charging excessive rates, at least if it's working correctly. So the idea is that government regulation is trying to eliminate those monopoly profits by forcing industry to make good economic decisions and produce at the point where, at the price level, if you will, where it equals their average total cost. Okay? And so that is considered a fair return to capital, and eliminates those economic or monopoly profits. Now, just to give you an idea, when the Interstate Commerce Commission was regulating the trucking industry, and the railroads too, the rule of thumb was 4% profit. 4% profit. That was it. And much of their effort in the costing department, which is where I was working at, was to gather cost data submitted by the carriers and then evaluate that cost data to make sure that the rates that they were charging did not exceed a 4% markup over those costs. Okay, so we end up with a new, greater quantity at a lower regulated price, and the whole idea is to reduce the price, increase the amount of output, and thereby eliminate the monopoly profits. Okay, again, that may be a little bit more information than you were looking for, but that's part of why you increase your education, isn't it? So, again, these seminars are designed to be a preview of your reading and to kind of point you in a couple directions. So by now, you can go back through the slides. As a matter of fact, the slides are in doc sharing for you. And you should be able to go back and be able to compute what the price effect is and what the quantity effect is, and how that affects or how that changes given different scenarios. So you do definitely want to take a look at your homework assignment for this week before you start doing your reading, so that you can see what calculations you're going to need to make and how you're going to have to go make them, and then what explanations you're going to need to provide. So what do we have to do this week? You've got chapter 13. Your discussion thread this week is going to look at what you consider to be real-world monopolies. Notice that I've thrown Microsoft in there. Is it really a monopoly or not? So we'll talk about that. You might also think back to the assignment that we had the discussion we had dealing with prescription medications, and whether or not the pharmaceutical companies, were they actually acting as a monopoly? rather than as a perfectly competitive industry? If so, would that have changed our approach to regulating them, or not regulating them? So you can include that discussion in your discussion if you wish. Your assignment for this week, as I mentioned earlier, has you looking at a subway system, has you looking at some movies, and has you looking at a public utility. In part of that, you'll be discussing the difference between price effect and quantity effect. In one of the other questions, you'll be looking at total revenue versus marginal revenue. And in the other question, you'll be considering monopoly price versus government price ceilings. And then remember that Unit 9 and Unit 10 go together, so some of what we discussed tonight you will see again in Unit 10's assignment, because Unit 10 covers both Unit 9 and 10. Okay, continuing on, you know how to contact me. None of that has changed, so please get a hold of me if you have any questions. And with that, again, this is a pre-recorded seminar, so I will definitely be with you in next week's seminar, and we'll see you in the discussions. Thank you very much for attending, and we get out a little bit early tonight. Thank you.